The battlefield was a chaotic wasteland of smoke, fire, and destruction. Explosions shook the ground, and the cries of soldiers echoed through the air. Among the ruins of what was once a thriving city, an alien girl named Ayla lay motionless. Her small, fragile body was covered in cuts and bruises, her pale blue skin shimmering faintly under the dim light of the war-torn sky. She wasn't from this planet. She didn't even belong to this war. Ayla had been traveling in her small starship, a routine journey to reunite with her family on a distant planet. But something had gone wrong. Her ship's navigation system malfunctioned, pulling her into the orbit of this hostile world. Before she could regain control, an enemy missile hit her ship, forcing her to crash land. Now she was alone, scared, and badly injured in the middle of a war she didn't understand. Around her, the battlefield showed no mercy. Soldiers from various species fought relentlessly, their weapons blazing. To them, Ayla was invisible. She was just another piece of debris on the ground, not worth noticing. Some soldiers glanced at her as they ran past, but none stopped. They had their own battles to fight, and Ayla's life didn't matter to them. She tried to move but winced in pain. Her left leg was broken, and a sharp piece of metal was lodged in her side. Her large, glowing eyes filled with tears as she realized her dire situation. She thought about her family, wondering if she would ever see them again. Fear gripped her heart. What if she died here, alone and forgotten? Ayla's body trembled as she lay among the rubble, trying to stay quiet. The loud blasts and heavy footsteps of soldiers made her heart race. She didn't know if these people were friendly or dangerous. All she knew was that she had to survive. But how could she? She was weak, injured, and had no one to help her. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. Ayla couldn't tell. Time seemed to blur as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time she opened her eyes, the scene around her seemed more hopeless. The sounds of battle never stopped. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning metal. She had never seen anything like this before. Her peaceful homeworld felt like a distant dream. As she lay there, her mind started to wander. She remembered her parents and their warm smiles. She thought about her siblings and their laughter. These memories gave her a small spark of hope, but it wasn't enough to fight the darkness creeping into her mind. She felt so small and helpless. Was this how her story would end? Suddenly, footsteps approached. They were heavy and steady, not like the frantic running of the soldiers. Ayla's heart skipped a beat. She tried to turn her head to see who it was, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Her vision was blurry, but she could make out the figure of someone tall and wearing a strange uniform. The person stopped near her, and for a moment, Ayla thought they would pass her by like everyone else. But then the figure knelt down. Dr. Ethan Cole, a human medic, had been working tirelessly to save as many lives as he could. The battlefield was chaos, but he had trained for this. With his medical kit slung over his shoulder, he scanned the area for more injured soldiers. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought she was just another casualty of war, but something about her caught his attention. She wasn't like anyone he had seen before. Her alien features were delicate, and despite her injuries, she looked innocent. Ethan hesitated for a moment. He had been taught to prioritize his own people, to focus on those who could still fight. But as he looked at the alien girl, something inside him stirred. He couldn't just leave her there. It didn't matter where she came from or what species she was. She was alive, and she needed help. "Hang in there," he said softly, even though he knew she wouldn't understand. His voice was calm, almost comforting. He reached into his medical kit and pulled out a scanner to check her vitals. She was barely holding on, but there was a chance to save her. Gently, Ethan lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her body limp but still breathing. He carried her back to his small medical tent, ignoring the judgmental stares of other soldiers. They whispered among themselves, wondering why he was wasting his time on an alien. Ethan didn't care what they thought. To him, every life mattered. And as he worked to save the alien girl, he couldn't help but feel that their meeting was more than just an accident. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Dr. Ethan Cole moved quickly across the chaotic battlefield, his medical kit strapped tightly to his back. The air was thick with smoke, and the sounds of war surrounded him. The distant roar of artillery, the crackle of energy weapons, and the cries of the injured. His job was clear: to save as many lives as possible, no matter the danger. Ethan was a field medic, a role he had chosen not because he loved war, but because he believed in saving lives. He was stationed on this war-torn planet as part of the human military alliance. The fighting here was brutal, with countless casualties from different species. To Ethan, it didn't matter what they looked like or where they came from. If they needed help, he would give it. The medic's tent was a small haven amid the chaos, but even there, it was barely holding together. The wounded lay on stretchers, groaning in pain as Ethan and his team worked tirelessly to stabilize them. Supplies were running low, and every decision felt like a gamble. Should he use the last of the antiseptics on the soldier with a missing arm, or save it for the one with a severe infection? These choices haunted him every day. Ethan had just finished treating a young human soldier when he spotted something unusual in the distance. Amid the rubble and debris, a small figure lay still. It didn't look like one of the soldiers or the local inhabitants. Curiosity and concern tugged at him. He grabbed his scanner and headed toward the figure. As he approached, Ethan's heart sank. It was an alien girl, her pale blue skin bruised and bloodied. She was barely breathing. Her large, glowing eyes were half closed, filled with pain and fear. He had never seen a species like hers before. Her fragile frame and shimmering skin made her seem almost otherworldly, even in a galaxy filled with diverse beings. "What happened to you?" Ethan murmured, kneeling beside her. He quickly scanned her with his portable medical device. The readings were grim. Her left leg was broken. She had internal bleeding, and there was a sharp piece of metal lodged in her side. She wouldn't survive long without immediate care. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He reached for his comm unit to call for backup but paused. The battlefield wasn't safe, and he doubted anyone would prioritize an alien girl over their own soldiers. Even his fellow medics might question why he was wasting time on her. The military code was clear: prioritize your own. But Ethan didn't care about the code. He couldn't just leave her here to die. "You're coming with me," he said firmly, even though he knew she couldn't understand him. Carefully, Ethan lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her body limp and fragile. As he carried her back to the tent, he could feel the stares of other soldiers. Some whispered among themselves, questioning his decision. A few even laughed, calling it a waste of time. "Why are you helping that alien?" One soldier called out, his tone mocking. "She's not one of us." Ethan shot him a glare but didn't respond. He didn't have time to argue. The girl's life was hanging by a thread, and every second counted. Inside the tent, Ethan cleared a space on one of the tables and gently laid her down. His assistant, a young medic named Sarah, looked at him in surprise. "What is that?" she asked, pointing to the alien. "Her name is Ayla," Ethan replied, though he had no idea if that was true. He just didn't want to refer to her as it. "She's hurt, and we're going to save her." Sarah hesitated but nodded. She trusted Ethan's judgment, even if she didn't fully understand it. Together, they worked to stabilize Ayla. Ethan removed the shard of metal from her side, carefully stitching the wound closed. He set her broken leg and wrapped it in a makeshift splint. Her alien physiology was different, but Ethan adapted quickly, using his experience and the scanner to guide him. As they worked, Ayla's breathing became steadier. Her glowing eyes fluttered open for a moment, locking onto Ethan's. He smiled at her, hoping to convey that she was safe now. "You're going to be okay," he said softly. By the time they finished, Ethan was exhausted, but he felt a small sense of relief. Ayla was stable, at least for now. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was determined to protect her. Looking at her peaceful face, he felt a strange connection. She had been abandoned by everyone else, but not by him. "Rest now," he whispered, pulling a blanket over her. "You're not alone anymore." As the tent grew quiet, Ethan glanced outside. The war raged on, but for a brief moment, he felt like he had done something right. Saving one life, even an alien's, reminded him why he had become a medic in the first place. The small medical tent was a fragile sanctuary in the middle of chaos. Outside, the battle roared on, but inside, Ethan focused entirely on saving the alien girl. He refused to let the war distract him. Ayla lay on a stretcher, her pale blue skin glowing faintly under the dim lights. Her breathing was shallow but steady, a sign that she still had a chance. Ethan had seen many injured soldiers, but treating Ayla was different. Her physiology was unlike anything he had encountered before. Her veins glowed faintly under her skin, and her blood was a shimmering silver. His medical scanner struggled to identify her vital signs, forcing Ethan to rely on his instincts and years of experience. "Sarah, hand me the advanced stabilizer," Ethan said, his voice calm but urgent. His assistant quickly passed him the device. It was one of their last high-tech tools, but Ethan didn't hesitate to use it. The stabilizer hummed as he pressed it against Ayla's side, where the shard of metal had caused severe internal damage. Slowly, the bleeding stopped, and her breathing improved. "Her body, it's repairing itself," Sarah said, staring at the monitor. "Not like a human's, but it's working." Ethan nodded. "She's strong, stronger than she looks, but she's not out of danger yet." Hours passed as Ethan and Sarah worked tirelessly to stabilize Ayla. They cleaned her wounds, set her broken leg, and monitored her vital signs. At one point, Ayla stirred, her glowing eyes flickering open. She looked at Ethan, confusion and fear evident in her gaze. Ethan leaned closer, speaking in a soothing tone. "It's okay. You're safe now," he said, even though he knew she didn't understand his words. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, hoping to convey his intentions. Ayla's eyes fluttered shut again, her body too weak to stay awake. As the hours turned into the next day, Ethan noticed small changes in her condition. The advanced stabilizer had worked better than he had hoped. Her alien physiology seemed to be accelerating her recovery, though her injuries were still severe. Ethan found himself marveling at her resilience. "Who are you?" he muttered softly, studying her peaceful face. She was so different, yet so familiar in a way he couldn't explain. He couldn't shake the feeling that fate had brought her to him for a reason. The tent door flapped open, and a soldier stepped in. It was Lieutenant Harris, a hard-faced man who had little patience for anything outside protocol. His sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on Ayla. He frowned. "You're still wasting resources on that alien," Harris said, his tone full of disapproval. "We have our own people dying out there, Cole." Ethan didn't look up. "I'm saving a life. That's my job." Harris crossed his arms. "Your job is to prioritize human soldiers. This thing isn't one of us. Why risk everything for her?" Ethan's hands paused for a moment. Then he turned to face Harris. "Because she's alive. Because she deserves a chance, just like anyone else. If we start deciding who is worth saving and who isn't, then we've already lost this war." Harris opened his mouth to argue but stopped. He glared at Ethan for a moment longer before storming out of the tent. Ethan let out a breath, shaking his head. He knew not everyone would agree with his decision, but he didn't care. He had made his choice. Later that night, as the battlefield outside quieted, Ethan sat beside Ayla. He watched her chest rise and fall, each breath a small victory. He wondered about her story. Where had she come from? How had she ended up here? Did she have a family looking for her? Suddenly, Ayla's eyes opened again. This time, they lingered on Ethan, studying him with a mix of curiosity and gratitude. She raised a trembling hand, pointing to herself. "La," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. Ethan's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Ayla, that's your name? She nodded slowly, her glowing eyes watching him. Ethan smiled, feeling the strange warmth in his chest. I'm Ethan, he said, pointing to himself. Ayla's lips curved into a faint smile before she drifted back to sleep. For the first time, Ethan felt like he had made a connection, however small. It gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He would do everything in his power to help her recover and get her to safety. As the stars twinkled above the tattered tent, Ethan sat quietly, planning his next steps. The war might still rage outside, but here, in this small corner of the battlefield, a different kind of battle was being fought. One for trust, survival, and hope. And for Ethan, it was a battle worth fighting. The morning light filtered into the small medical tent, casting soft shadows on the walls. Ayla stirred on the stretcher, her glowing eyes slowly opening. She winced as she tried to move, her body still weak from the injuries. Ethan, sitting nearby with his datapad, noticed her waking up and quickly set it aside. "Good morning," he said gently, stepping closer. His voice was calm and warm, trying to make her feel safe. Ayla looked at him, her glowing eyes reflecting uncertainty and curiosity. She tilted her head slightly, trying to make sense of the human standing before her. The day before, she had caught glimpses of him, but now she was more awake. He was tall, with messy brown hair and kind green eyes. His uniform was worn, stained with the effort of saving lives. "Ayla," Ethan said, pointing to her. Then he pointed to himself. "Ethan." She blinked, her lips pressing together as she processed his words. After a moment, she nodded slowly. Then, she repeated, her voice soft and shaky. Ethan smiled. "That's right. Ayla, you're safe now. No one will hurt you here." He didn't know if she understood, but he hoped his tone and expression would convey his message. Ayla's hand moved slightly, pointing to her chest. "Ayla," she said, her voice a little stronger this time. Ethan nodded. "Yes, Ayla, you're going to be okay." Over the next few hours, Ethan stayed close to Ayla, tending to her injuries and making sure she was comfortable. Though they couldn't communicate fully, they began to form a bond. Ethan's gentle actions and calm presence seemed to put her at ease. She watched him closely as he worked, her large, glowing eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and curiosity. At one point, Ethan brought her a bowl of nutrient-rich broth. "You need to eat something," he said, holding it out to her. Ayla hesitated, unsure of the unfamiliar food. Ethan took a small spoonful and minded eating it himself. "See, it's safe." Ayla's lips twitched into a faint smile as she reached for the bowl. She took a cautious sip, her face relaxing as the warm liquid soothed her. Ethan couldn't help but chuckle. "There you go. That'll help you get your strength back." As the day went on, Ayla's trust in Ethan grew. She began to mimic his gestures, trying to understand his words. Ethan, in turn, tried to learn from her. He noticed how she would point to certain things and make soft sounds, as if trying to teach him her language. Though their communication was limited, it felt like progress. Later that evening, Ethan decided to show her something. He pulled out a small hologram device from his pocket. "Let me show you something," he said. Activating it, a projection appeared, showing a serene meadow with tall grass and bright flowers. It was a recording from his home planet, Earth. Ayla's eyes widened as she gazed at the hologram. She reached out, her fingers brushing through the light as if trying to touch the flowers. A soft smile spread across her face, the first real smile Ethan had seen from her. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Ethan said, watching her reaction. "That's Earth, my home." Ayla looked at him, then pointed to herself. She made a series of soft sounds, her voice musical and unfamiliar. Ethan guessed she was trying to tell him about her own home. "Your home must be beautiful too," he said, nodding. "We'll figure out how to get you back there. I promise." Ayla's smile faded slightly, and she looked down, her expression troubled. Ethan's heart ached. He could only imagine what she had been through. Whatever had brought her here, it had left her scared and alone. But he was determined to help her heal, physically and emotionally. That night, as Ayla rested, Ethan sat nearby, thinking about the strange turn his life had taken. He had joined the war to save lives, but he never expected to find himself caring for an alien girl. Yet, as he watched her sleep, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. "We'll get through this," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Together. In the quiet of the tent, amid the distant sounds of battle, a fragile new friendship had begun. Though their worlds were vastly different, Ethan and Ayla had found something rare and precious, a connection that transcended language, species, and war. The war outside grew louder with each passing day, and the small medical tent no longer felt safe. Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before the enemy forces closed in on their location. Staying here wasn't an option anymore. He had to get Ayla to safety. Late one night, Ethan sat at his desk, poring over maps and supply lists. The flickering lamp cast long shadows, but he didn't notice. His focus was entirely on planning their escape. Sarah, his assistant, stood nearby, her arms crossed as she watched him. "This isn't going to be easy," she said, her voice low. "The roads are crawling with enemy patrols. Even if we make it out of the camp, there's no guarantee we'll survive." Ethan looked up, determination shining in his eyes. "We don't have a choice, Sarah. If we stay here, she'll die, and I won't let that happen." Sarah sighed, shaking her head. "You're risking everything for her. You barely know her." "I know enough," Ethan replied firmly. "She's alone, scared, and hurt. If we don't help her, who will?" Sarah didn't argue further. She had seen the bond forming between Ethan and Ayla, and deep down, she admired his unwavering compassion. The next morning, Ethan approached Ayla. She was sitting on the stretcher, her strength slowly returning. When she saw him, she tilted her head, her glowing eyes filled with curiosity. Ethan crouched down in front of her, holding up the map. He pointed to their current location, then traced his finger along a route that led to a distant safe zone. "We're here," he said, speaking slowly. "We need to go here. It's safe." Ayla watched his gestures closely. She didn't understand all the words, but she caught the meaning. Her eyes flicked to the map, then back to Ethan. Slowly, she nodded. "Good," Ethan said, smiling. "We'll leave tonight." As the day wore on, Ethan and Sarah prepared for the journey. They packed medical supplies, rations, and a few weapons for protection. Every move was made in silence, their nerves on edge. Ayla helped as best as she could, following Ethan's lead and mimicking his actions. Though she was still weak, she insisted on carrying a small bag, refusing to be a burden. Night fell, and the camp was eerily quiet. Most of the soldiers were either asleep or out on patrol, leaving the medical tent unguarded. Ethan took a deep breath as he looked at Sarah and Ayla. "Are you ready?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "Ready as I'll ever be." Ayla's glowing eyes met Ethan's, and she gave a small, determined nod. He smiled at her courage. They slipped out of the tent, moving silently through the shadows. Ethan led the way, his heart pounding with every step. The camp was a maze of tents and vehicles, but he had memorized the layout. He knew exactly where the gaps in the patrols were, and he used them to their advantage. When they reached the edge of the camp, Ethan signaled for them to stop. A single guard stood nearby, his back turned. Ethan motioned for Sarah to stay with Ayla while he crept forward. He moved with practiced precision, disabling the guard quietly and without alerting anyone. "Let's go," he whispered, waving them forward. They slipped into the forest beyond the camp, the tall trees providing cover. The air was cold, and the sounds of the forest mixed with the distant rumble of explosions. Ethan kept his weapon ready, his eyes scanning for any signs of danger. Ayla stayed close to him, her movements careful but steady. Hours passed as they made their way through the forest. The journey was grueling, but no one complained. Ethan's determination kept them moving, and Ayla's quiet strength inspired him. She didn't speak much, but her presence was a reminder of why they were doing this. Finally, as dawn broke, they reached a small clearing. In the distance, a hidden shuttle lay waiting, their ticket to safety. Relief washed over Ethan as he turned to the others. "We're almost there," he said, a smile breaking across his face. But before they could take another step, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Ethan's smile vanished as he turned, his weapon raised. A group of enemy soldiers emerged from the trees, their weapons aimed. "Run," Ethan shouted, stepping in front of Ayla and Sarah. The escape wasn't over yet, and Ethan knew he would do whatever it took to protect them. As the enemy closed in, the fragile hope they carried burned brighter, pushing them forward toward freedom. The enemy soldiers stepped into the clearing, their weapons glinting in the early morning light. Ethan's heart pounded as he held his rifle steady, positioning himself between the approaching soldiers and his companions. Behind him, Ayla and Sarah stood frozen, their faces pale with fear. "Stay behind me," Ethan said firmly, his voice low but commanding. He couldn't let anything happen to them, not when they had come this far. The lead soldier raised his weapon, his expression cold and unyielding. "Surrender now, and we'll make this quick," he barked. Ethan shook his head. Not a chance. He fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to buy some time. The sound echoed through the clearing, and the enemy soldiers tensed, their fingers tightening on their triggers. Before anyone could fire, Ayla stepped forward. Her glowing eyes were fierce, and she raised a hand, her fingers moving in a fluid, intricate pattern. A soft hum filled the air, and suddenly, a shimmering barrier appeared between them and the enemy. The soldiers hesitated, confusion spreading across their faces. One of them fired a shot, but the bullet dissolved against the barrier like water hitting a wall. Ayla's knees wobbled slightly, but she held her ground, her focus unbroken. "Ayla, no," Ethan shouted, turning to her. "You're not strong enough for this." She glanced at him, determination burning in her eyes. Though her body trembled with exhaustion, she didn't back down. She knew this was their only chance. Ethan clenched his jaw, realizing he had no choice but to trust her. "Sarah, take her to the shuttle," he ordered. "I'll hold them off." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She grabbed Ayla's arm gently, guiding her toward the waiting shuttle. "Come on, we're almost there," she said, her voice urgent but reassuring. The enemy soldiers recovered from their initial shock and began to advance, their weapons ready. Ethan fired a few shots, hitting one soldier in the leg and forcing the others to take cover, but he knew he couldn't hold them off for long. Ayla stopped mid-step, pulling away from Sarah. She turned back to Ethan, her hands glowing faintly. Summoning the last of her strength, she sent a surge of energy toward the enemy. The ground beneath their feet erupted in a burst of light, sending them sprawling. Ethan's eyes widened in awe, but he didn't waste the opportunity. "Go. Now," he shouted to Sarah and Ayla. This time, Ayla didn't argue. She allowed Sarah to guide her to the shuttle. Ethan covered their retreat, his aim precise as he kept the enemy pinned down. He could hear the hum of the shuttle's engine as it powered up, a sound that filled him with both relief and urgency. The enemy regrouped quickly, and their leader barked orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Take them down. Don't let them escape." Ethan felt a sharp pain in his shoulder as a bullet grazed him, but he didn't falter. He turned and sprinted toward the shuttle, firing over his shoulder to keep the soldiers at bay. The ramp was already lowering, and Sarah stood at the entrance, waving him in. "Come on, Ethan," she shouted. He reached the shuttle just as the soldiers opened fire again. Bullets ricocheted off the metal hull, and sparks flew around him. Ethan dove onto the ramp, pulling himself inside as Sarah slammed the control panel to close the door. The shuttle lifted off, its engines roaring as it soared into the sky. Ethan collapsed onto the floor, breathing heavily. His shoulder throbbed with pain, but he was alive. They all were. Ayla knelt beside him, her glowing eyes filled with worry. She reached out, placing her hand gently on his injured shoulder. A soft warmth spread through him, easing the pain. He looked at her, gratitude and admiration in his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly. She gave him a small smile, her exhaustion evident. Sarah sat down nearby, her face pale but relieved. "We made it," she said, her voice shaky. "I can't believe we actually made it." Ethan nodded, leaning back against the wall. "It's not over yet," he said, his gaze shifting to the horizon. "But we got a fighting chance now." As the shuttle soared higher, leaving the battlefield behind, the three of them sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The battle had been fierce, but their bond had grown stronger. Together, they had faced the impossible and survived. And together, they would face whatever came next. The shuttle soared through the clouds, leaving the battlefield far behind. Ethan leaned back against the cold metal wall, exhaustion finally catching up to him. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fight was gone, replaced by a dull ache in his injured shoulder. But for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. Sarah sat across from him, her face pale but determined. She was busy checking their supplies, making sure they had enough food and medical equipment to last the journey. Ayla, still weak from her effort during the escape, sat quietly nearby, her glowing eyes scanning the room. She looked at Ethan with a mixture of gratitude and worry. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked, glancing at Ethan. "I've been better," he replied with a small smile. "But we're alive. That's what matters." Ayla tilted her head, watching them. She didn't understand all their words, but she could sense the relief in their voices. Slowly, she reached out and placed her hand over Ethan's injured shoulder. A faint glow surrounded her hand, and Ethan felt the pain ease slightly. He looked at her, surprised. "Thank you," he said softly. Ayla smiled, her expression gentle but tired. Though she was still learning their language, her actions spoke louder than words. The shuttle's pilot, an old gruff man named Garrett, poked his head into the cabin. "We'll be landing in an hour," he said. "The safe zone is just ahead. But don't get too comfortable. The enemy might still be looking for us." Ethan nodded, his mind already racing. They had made it this far, but the journey wasn't over. The safe zone was a temporary refuge, not a permanent solution. He needed to figure out their next steps. As the shuttle descended, the group prepared for landing. Sarah double-checked the supplies, while Ethan helped Ayla strap into her seat. The young alien girl's eyes widened as she looked out the window, seeing the lush green forests below. For the first time, she seemed truly at ease. The shuttle touched down in a clearing surrounded by tall trees. A small group of humans emerged from the woods, their weapons drawn. Ethan stepped out first, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "We're refugees," he said. "We need help." One of the humans, a woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, stepped forward. "Refugees," she repeated, her gaze sweeping over the group. When her eyes landed on Ayla, they narrowed. "What's she?" "She's with us," Ethan said firmly. "She's not a threat. In fact, she saved our lives." The woman studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fine, but you'll need to explain everything. Follow me." The group was led to a small camp hidden deep in the forest. It was a humble place, with makeshift shelters and limited supplies, but it was safe. For now, that was enough. As they settled in, Ethan found himself sitting by a fire with Ayla. The young alien watched the flames dance, her expression thoughtful. Slowly, she turned to Ethan and pointed to the sky. Her glowing eyes seemed to ask a question. "You want to go home?" Ethan guessed. Ayla nodded, her face tinged with sadness. She missed her planet, her people, but she also knew that returning wasn't possible. Not yet. The war had torn her life apart, and Earth was her only refuge for now. "We'll figure it out," Ethan said, his voice steady. I don't know how, but we will. You're not alone anymore." Ayla smiled faintly, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. For the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider. Ethan's words gave her a sense of belonging she hadn't felt since the war began. Over the next few days, the group worked to integrate into the camp. Ayla's unique abilities quickly gained attention, and the other refugees began to accept her. Her kindness and quiet strength won them over, and she became a symbol of hope for the struggling community. Ethan and Sarah used their medical skills to help the injured, earning the trust of the camp's leaders. Together, they began to rebuild, one step at a time. The war wasn't over, but they had found a small pocket of peace. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, Ethan stood at the edge of the camp, looking out at the horizon. Ayla joined him, her glowing eyes reflecting the fading light. "We have a long way to go," Ethan said quietly. Ayla nodded, her expression calm but resolute. Together, they had survived impossible odds. Now they had a chance to build something new, a future filled with hope, trust, and unity. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Ethan and Ayla stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they also knew they wouldn't face it alone.